Hi, I couldn't be at school today, so I'm going to do a screen capture video for you to demonstrate visual dynamics. Visual dynamics talks about how your eye moves around a work of art. We can create visual dynamics with a few different techniques. Today I'm going to talk about leading lines, rule of thirds, framing, and value contrast. First, I'm going to talk about leading lines because I think that they are the easiest. I'm going to bring up a few examples here. Here's one photograph that I think demonstrates leading lines. It creates leading lines by repeating these circular shapes, and they line up in a row. We call this implied line. I'll show you where the lines are. Get some bright red paint here. The lines move our eye in this direction. See that? Oops. That's a good example of leading lines. Although this does something that I don't prefer for leading lines. Leading lines should usually lead to a point, not lead your eye off the page and make you look away from the photo. But this is an example of leading lines. Here's another example of leading lines. This one does it more to my liking. It moves us to a point within the picture. It moves our eye from the bottom up towards the top, and then from the top right to this point here. Good example of leading lines. I want you to pay attention to how I'm diagramming these. I'm using red lines that show where the eye is moving. Another example of leading lines is a photograph by a guy named Ansel Adams. Our eye travels along the stream up to this point in here. Okay? I think that's a good grouping of leading lines. I don't think I need to show you any more. I'd like to move on to framing. Framing is where we have a shape around our main subject. It creates a frame, kind of like the frame of a picture. In this case, the windowsill frames these kids in and draws our attention to the kids. The purpose of framing is to put more importance on one thing by putting a box around it. Here's another good example. This is a photo by Sebastião Salgado. I like this one quite a bit. We've got this archway that creates a frame around these people, draws our attention to them. Good example of framing. Another photograph by a guy that I really like. This one is by a guy named Ralph Eugene Meatyard. This does two things. It does value contrast and it does framing. We've got this woman framed in by this arch. Draws our attention right to her. Okay? So that's framing. Let's move on to value contrast. Value contrast should be very, very simple and very obvious. It means dark things stand out against a light background, or light things stand out against a dark background. So our attention goes to this woman's face because it's very light against a dark background. It's another photo by Sebastião Salgado. The trickiest thing that we're going to talk about today is the rule of thirds. Rule of thirds can be used in two different ways. For starters, just to remind you, rule of thirds says that when we have a work of art, we can break it up into three parts vertically, and horizontally, and you get this grid. Okay? It's roughly thirds, it's not perfect. And rule of third also says that the important things are going to fall either at the intersections or along the lines. So if we look at this photograph, these two girls, my daughter and my niece, fall roughly at one of those intersections. Okay? Here's another example that does rule of thirds. Although in this case, rule of thirds is used to create what's called a 2-to-1 composition. It's 2 parts background over here and 1 part Georgia O'Keeffe's face. This is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, and this is Georgia O'Keeffe, famous painter. So 1/3 her face, 2/3 background. Here's an example where we have roughly the girl's eyes fall right along the top third line. So important things are falling along the 1/3 line. Oops. And the middle of her face falls roughly at the upper left intersection. Good use of rule of thirds. Here's another example that does what's called the 2-to-1 composition. Actually, this breaks it up into even thirds. We've got 1/3 sky and cliff, 1/3 rocky beach, and 1/3 big weird ear. And the last rule of thirds that I want to show you is 2/3 billboard, 1/3 people. See that? So bottom third is people, 2/3 is building. It's a good way to create a balance in your work of art.